The two Koreas marked the 6-year anniversary of the historic Panmunjeom Declaration, but inter-Korean tensions are reaching new highs. North Korea persists in its hostility towards the South, actively undermining the military tension reduction agreement while boosting exchanges with Russia and Iran. All this while the possibility of Trump's second presidency is complicating South Korea's efforts to fortify its military alliance with the U.S. and protect itself from North Korea threats. For an expert analysis on the latest security dynamics on the Korean Peninsula, we have our weekly commentator Go Myong-hyun from the Institute for National Security Strategy joining us in the studio. Always a pleasure to have you with us.
Great to be here.
We also have John Nilsson-Wright, head of the Japan and Korea's program at Cambridge University's Center for Geopolitics, joining us from the UK. It's so great to have you on our show.
It's great to be back.
All right. The first one's for you, Dr. Go. It has been found that North Korea has planted landmines in all the roads connecting the two Koreas in the DMZ, the roads which were built as part of the 2018 Inter-Korean Military Agreement. What do you make of this?
So this is another political step, I would say, taken by North Korea to signal to South Korea and the wider international community that the tensions in the Korean Peninsula is on the rise, as you pointed out, so that the reversal or like the disruption in the intercorean relations is not temporary, it's in fact irreversible. So this is essentially like a political gesture on the part of North Korea, because in practice, these roads, there are 10 of them, and back in 2018, their reconnection between the northern side and the southern side were hailed as a major achievement by the then President Moon Jae-in. But then they haven't been used in practice by any means in all this time. So in that sense, it doesn't really disrupt any kind of a transportation network between the two Koreas because it doesn't exist. So this is really about sending a signal. And so it's happening on the heels of what happened earlier, North Korea dismantling their inter-Korean agencies, as well as the symbols, the inter-Korean development, monuments and writings and so forth. And so I think the different parts of the North Korean government now, this time, including the military, essentially they are carrying out the order that Kim Jong-un has given out to make this breakup of intercorean relations irreversible. So we're going to see further steps in this regard in the near future, but therefore we shouldn't be surprised anymore by these kind of actions.
Exactly. We've talked about similar behaviors before, and so this is another way of North Korea showing its resolve to sever all relations with the South, and you believe that it's not temporary, but is rather irreversible. It's reached the point where it's become irreversible. It is quite concerning. Now, Dr. Nilsson-Wright, North Korea issued a series of statements last week warning of a strong response against a new North Korea monitoring system currently in the works. The U.S. is mulling options to create a new mechanism for monitoring sanctions on North Korea's nuclear program with its allies. What do we know so far about the new system, and what are your prospects?
Well, at this stage, I think it's too early to describe this as a system, but you'll recall, of course, that Russia vetoed the so-called UN panel of experts on North Korea. China abstained. That meant effectively that a body that has been in place for some 15 years to provide effective monitoring of the sanctions regime is no longer effective. We've seen, therefore, the United States launch a very concerted diplomatic initiative, most dramatically, I suppose, and most powerfully, the visit by Linda Thomas-Greenfield, the US ambassador to the United Nations, to both South Korea and Japan recently, the first time in 7 years the US has sent a UN ambassador to South Korea, in an effort to demonstrate the resolve of Washington, Seoul, and Tokyo to put in place mechanisms to keep the focus on the question of North Korea's sanctions violations. We've also seen other US officials, Jung Park, the US envoy on North Korea, traveling throughout Europe to Romania, Sweden, and Poland in particular, again, to have high-level discussions on how best to keep so-called like-minded allies together in enforcing the sanctions regime. And recently, just last week, the 14th Defense Trilateral talks between the United States, South Korea, and Japanese senior defense officials all have been highlighting North Korea's systematic violations of UN sanctions, whether it's ballistic missile tests, most worryingly of all, of course, I suppose, the equipment transfers to Russia that have aided Russia's efforts in the war in Ukraine. So we're seeing, I think, a concerted effort by the United States and its regional allies to use declaratory policy as a way of putting pressure on North Korea. There will be other efforts, I suspect, using the framework of AUKUS, talk of perhaps having other countries, Japan and South Korea, involved in Pillar 2 of the AUKUS initiative to try again to see how best the United States and its allies can enforce that sanctions regime. But it's a difficult prospect. And of course, we're seeing a North Korea that is violating and flouting those sanctions across the board in so many different areas.
The UN monitoring that had been in place for the last 14 years was terminated yesterday. Hopefully the U.S. and its allies and other like-minded nations can come up with an effective tool soon that won't be affected by Russia and China's possible attempts to block those efforts. And in related question, Dr. Go, Kim Jong-un, during his trip to a top military university, showed up with a group of new customized Toyota SUVs, once again showing the state's ability to dodge sanctions. And as Dr. Nilsson-Wright has alluded to, I know that it'll be extremely difficult, but how can we remove some of those surveillance blind spots?
So it's no longer a blind spot when it comes to sanctions evasion. These are major highway connections. We are talking about China and Russia abetting North Korea's evasive activities. And I think Russia has become a major conduit for this kind of sanction items being moved from a wider world into North Korea proper. So there are a couple of clues to figure out what could have been the potential route for smuggling the sanction item, in this case Toyota's Land Cruisers. These are the names of the particular cars that we have observed in the news reports. And this is the most luxurious model of the Land Cruiser series, and these are only available in certain geographic locations around the world, even though it's a Japanese make. So it's available not in the United States, not in South Korea, not in many parts of Asia, but then they are widely popular in Russia and the Middle East. So it's possible that the Russians abetted this kind of smuggling by North Koreans. And in fact, it might not even have been a smuggling activity. It could have been a part of a gift package given by Vladimir Putin to Kim Jong-un. We know that Russia has given Kim Jong-un a very luxurious presidential limousine called the Senate. So yeah, I think could have been an entire package that's already available in Russia. So we have to interpret this kind of signs of sanctions evasion by North Korea, not as a failure on the part of the sanctions regime, but in fact, this is in a paradoxical way, the success of sanctions. So the sanctions regime that has been in place, in force since 2017, with the partnership with like-minded states, but also active collaboration by other UN member states, have been able to really plug in many loopholes that that North Korea was taking advantage of around the world. But then now North Korea has very few choices left if they want to procure sanctioned items. So again, I mentioned China and Russia. So these are state actors that are abetting North Korea's sanctions activity, and they are also permanent members of the United Nations Security Council. So they are actively undermining the international monitoring regime on North Korea's sanctions evasion. So this is a reason why North Korea seems to be able to procure whatever luxury good that Kim Jong-un fancies to have. But on the other hand, we have to understand that the sanctions regime has been very successful in plugging other types of loopholes. So overall, I think we are whenever there's this kind of violations, we know who are the prime suspects. So this is, in a way, a progress.
So there are some blind spots, but the sanctions have been very successful and effective. Now, Dr. Nilsson-Wright, a North Korean delegation led by the state's trade minister visited Iran in a rare overseas trip. How concerned are you about growing military ties among North Korea, Iran, and Russia, and its threat to regional security?
Well, I think, notwithstanding what my fellow panelists has just been saying about the effectiveness of the sanctions regime, there's little doubt, I think, that North Korea feels emboldened because of these closer ties between Pyongyang and Moscow and Tehran and Beijing, the so-called new, if you like, axis of authoritarian regimes. We've seen that, of course, very particularly with the question of relations with Iran. the sending of a delegation in the last week or so to Iran to discuss trade collaboration. Diplomatic ties, of course, between Tehran and Pyongyang are not new. They were established in 1973, and technological exchange has been going on since that time, for example, during the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s. But since really about 2013, there has been much more active cooperation between the two governments. The United States Defense Intelligence Agency is concerned in particular about North Korea's export of medium-range missiles to Iran. And there's a suggestion that North Korea's no-dong missiles may have been used or been the basis for Iran's attack on Israel on April 13th. That's one very powerful reason to be concerned about this cooperation. There's also, of course, the wider question of Iran's nuclear program and North Korea's ability to enhance its uranium enrichment activities are clearly a source of instability. Even potentially support for Hamas from North Korea. The National Intelligence Service of South Korea has recently warned about the capacity of North Korea to provide Hamas with drone and paraglider technology, which may have been used in those very dramatic and devastating October 7th attacks on Israel. So all of this is a source of concern. North Korea, of course, has long been a source of instability in Northeast Asia, but now its reach is increasingly global. And of course, as we know all too well, the cooperation with Russia when it comes to supporting the war in Ukraine is a source of real concern. What's been behind that? Both the testing of North Korea's nuclear capabilities, or its conventional weapons capabilities, in return potentially for very important technological assistance in the satellite space when it comes to Russia's support for North Korea. But also more broadly, Belarus, of course, a Russian ally, supporting Russia's efforts in Ukraine. Its deputy foreign minister was recently in North Korea. All of this suggests a growing convergence and a greater emboldenedness on the part of the North Koreans to act as a regional source of provocation in so many different hotspots around the world. That's why, of course, the United States is striving so deliberately to shore up its alliance partnerships in Europe and also in East Asia.
The burgeoning ties between North Korea and Iran could serve to cement their three-way ties with Russia, and this, many experts say, will have multiple unwanted outcomes. And now, speaking of the three-way axis, Dr. Ko, Russian President Putin will visit China this month, where he's expected to hold a summit with President Xi. What is China's stance on the growing ties, military ties, among Russia, North Korea, and Iran? And how would President Xi deal with this issue during the summit?
Well, I don't think China finds this the formation of the emergence of the so-called three axis between Russia, North Korea, and Iran as a major provocation or challenge for China. We have to understand China is very much allied with Russia when it comes to the war in Ukraine. China has been very active in supplying Russia with the intermediate industrial inputs that are used by Russians to increase their defense productions, weapons production, so forth, and munitions. And again, North Korea is on the same page when it comes to assisting Russia with military weapons. The now famous transferable weapon system, including like a short-range ballistic missiles from North Korea and Russia. It's another sign that, strategically speaking, both China and North Korea aligned together in helping Russia and win the war in Ukraine, whereas South Korea is against that goal. And Iran is very much on board. So it's doubtful that China is concerned about the emergence of a new axis of evil, so to speak. So, but at the same time, China has other strategic goals. China is very much part of the international trade system, unlike Russia, North Korea, and Iran. And also, even as it's one of the foreign policy objectives of China is to remain influential. So he wants to be seen by the international community and the West as an honest broker when it comes to many conflicts that are taking place around the world, including Ukraine. And China has already put on the table essentially a peace plan for Ukraine. So in order for Chinese peace plan to be realized, he has to maintain not just good ties with Russia, but also with the West. So it means that China has to stay a prudent distance from Russia, North Korea, and Iran, but where at the same time assisting these countries with their provocations. So this is a very delicate balancing act on the part of China. But overall, I think that China fears that anything that undermines the U.S. influence around the world is going to be, in the long run, beneficial to their interest. So it means that the Chinese are going to stay away from condemning these kind of provocative acts, especially by North Korea and Iran. But at the same time, it wants to essentially to make sure that these provocations don't get out of hand. So that's the reason why China is not really essentially engaged in supplying weapon systems to Russia. So this is a kind of a delicate balancing act that China is trying to maintain right now.
And Dr. Nilsson-Wright, a major Chinese shipyard has harbored a cargo ship suspected to be linked to North Korea-Russia arms trade, according to recent satellite imagery. The U.S. State Department has responded that it takes the issue incredibly seriously. What is your biggest concern regarding China's possible involvement in this?
Well, really, again, it's sort of to echo the remarks of the previous speaker, which is, China wants to demonstrate that it has influence and capacity, but it also wants to tread a very delicate line. So there is a certain amount of ambiguity regarding this new intelligence. It's clear that the Angara, the Russian vessel that has been docked in the Chinese port, is involved, we think, in facilitating North Korean arms transfers to Russia. We've seen, of course, the United States and most recently Secretary of State Blinken in his visit to China emphasizing the importance of China desisting from providing this sort of material support to Russia in Ukraine. And I think we're going to see more of that pressure. Of course, the broader challenge from China is not merely, of course, the support for Russia, but also a whole range of different concerns ahead of the November election, worries about election interference, China's role, of course, in the South China Seas, and also Iran in the Middle East. China has described Iran's attack on Israel as an act of self-defense. It has not condemned the Hamas attacks publicly. It has sought to put the blame on the United States for instability in the Middle East. And this is an attempt by China, of course, to exploit the fact that the Biden administration is having to deal with a range of security and diplomatic challenges globally. So I think we're going to have to see how Beijing manages this process. And of course, the important trade relationship between the United States and China, in a way, acts as a further incentive for Beijing not to be seen to be excessively provocative. And therefore, it will continue to adopt this middle ground, if you like, seeking to exploit America's vulnerabilities and seeking to try and position itself as the indispensable actor who can resolve some of these security issues.
And staying with you, former U.S. President Trump reportedly suggested that the U.S. could withdraw its troops if South Korea does not contribute more to support U.S. troops stationed in Korea. His remarks came after Seoul and Washington wrapped up their first round of negotiations for new defense cost sharing set to be applied from 2026. Would the two countries be able to strike a deal before the U.S. presidential election? And what would happen in case of Trump's second presidency?
Well, I mean, I think there are two broad perspectives. There's a kind of optimistic view, which has been, I think, well telegraphed by the South Korean ambassador to Washington, Cho Hyun-dong, who argues that it's the institutionalization of US-ROK alliance ties, the result, of course, of the Yun-Biden bilateral summit not so long ago, and, of course, very importantly, the Camp David Accord last August between Seoul, Tokyo and Washington symbolized and I think put in place a much more reinforced trilateral effective alliance partnership, if you like, between those three countries. But alongside that very positive view about the institutionalization of the relationship, it is the public statements of candidate Trump in this presidential year that have been a source of great concern. Trump has gone on record at questioning America's need to maintain the US troop presence on the Korean Peninsula. It's no surprise that Donald Trump is a very transactional politician. We saw that in his first term as president, including his relationship with South Korea and Japan, putting pressure on the South Korean government to increase its defense expenditure. And of course, it was on the margins of the Trump-Kim summit back in 2018 in Singapore that we first saw the signs of Donald Trump flirting with the idea of a drawdown of US forces on the peninsula. He continues, as far as his public statements suggest, to make that argument. One of the big differences this time round is that the likely foreign policy team that he will bring into the White House if he's successful in November does not include the sort of safe hands, if you like, the experienced foreign and defense policy actors who might have had a restraining influence on him. And the worry, of course, is that if he is elected, he will be minded to take a much more aggressive transactional approach. And that's why America's allies, both Japan and South Korea, are particularly concerned about the risk of a possible diminution of American support for its traditional alliance partnerships. That's why the negotiations currently ongoing between the United States and South Korea over the exact amount that South Korea should be providing in support for the United States military presence on the Korean Peninsula are so important. They've been brought forward ahead of next year, precisely, I think, to try and create that added reassurance and to tie the hands of a potential future Trump administration if Donald Trump were elected.
All right, and the final point of our discussion today, Dr. Go, we saw a very interesting survey conducted by the CSIS. The results showed that 1/3 of South Korean experts support nuclearization of South Korea amid evolving North Korea's nuclear threat. What's your take on this? We're a little pressed on time, so if you could mention just briefly.
So sure, nuclear option on the part of South Korea has become more real than ever before, and precisely because of just we discussed the threat to the alliance, and the risk is coming from Washington rather than from Seoul. And one of the important components of the U.S. ROK alliance is the nuclear umbrella provided by the United States, and there's significant but small likelihood that this nuclear umbrella could be withdrawn under a different president in Washington. So therefore, in order to have a more leverage with our partner and ally, United States, even notionally, it would be actually beneficial for the South Korean government to entertain the idea of a nuclear option. And there are many different options that are equally valid and important, such as the redeployment of tactical nuclear weapons, U.S. tactical nuclear weapons, back to the peninsula before the South Korean government indeed puts a real weight behind the final option of nuclearization. So there's a gray area, there are potential area for deal making. So I wouldn't be too concerned about nuclear umbrella being withdrawn from the Korean Peninsula, but nonetheless, the South Korean government should be prepared for the prospect and prepare different options and put them on the table.
All right, this issue will continue to pop up amid North Korea's evolving nuclear threats, but we'll leave it at that for tonight. Thank you so much, Dr. Go and Dr. Nilsson-Wright, for sharing your thoughts. We appreciate it. And that brings us to the end of the show. Thank you for watching, and be sure to tune in same time tomorrow to join our conversation. Goodbye for now.